Well, welcome back, everybody, to what I have chosen to call a history of rock and roll. In film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. And yes, it's time to fess up to my bias once again, which I try to do regularly on hopefully every episode in one way or another, even if I don't explicitly state it as such. This one is personal. I saw the movie La Bamba when I was 9 years old, when it was brand new, and it helped get me into rock and roll in general, 50s rock and roll especially. But Back to the Future had already done a lot of the legwork in that regard in 1985. The soundtrack to this movie had a big impact on me. For some reason, my family liked soundtracks, and that's all I had when I was a little kid. I think my first cassettes or records that I possessed that were music-oriented and not like storybook, records were the Ghostbusters soundtrack, the Back to the Future soundtrack, and then eventually the La Bamba soundtrack. And then along with that, Huey Lewis and the News. So, which was a strong 50s influence, obviously, doo-wop and saxophone solos and stuff, which was what I was digging. I dug the way they mixed it with electric guitars, too. No one before or since has done it as effectively in such a pop way. But, the story of a 17-year-old rock and roll trailblazer dying so tragically it's weird. It's tough to come back to at my age now of 46 because I'm just going through, I just assume what everybody kind of tends to in our modern society where, I don't know, there's just things from your childhood that start hitting you harder at this age. And you really start reckoning with the stuff that made you who you were. And you look back at the decades and there's tons of stuff you don't remember that seemed important at the time. And you just go, yeah, man, maybe it was all hormones. Maybe it was just all those emotions. All those emotions are just a lot of hormones. And, but then there's the powerful experiences you have with friends and family and adventures you went on that shaped you and moral decisions you had to make. But really, I'm just becoming a lot more aware of the potency of things that affected us right before puberty. And I heard adults talk about that when I was young. I remember there was a movie called The Bear. I think it was called The Bear. Danny DeVito was in it. I never saw it. It seemed like a very somber, kind of depressing movie. The writer or director was having an interview on the radio talking about how the things that hit you, especially, right before puberty, are so much more powerful than people often recognize. And I didn't get that until recently. Let me look up The Bear to make sure I'm thinking of the right thing. Let's see. The Bear, Danny, Jack the Bear, 1993. I have a memory of hearing that and going, yeah, I'm feeling a lot of weird, depressed, dark things at my age, and I feel isolated, even though I have friends, and I don't know why. But yeah, damn. Danny DeVito, Reese Witherspoon, Gary Sinise, Julia Louis-Dreyfus, for crying out loud. The point is that was the first time an adult had said, the stuff you're going through right now, Jay Smith, is very, very potent and impactful and will shape you in ways that you may not realize and most adults don't admit to. I think La Bamba was, and I'm speaking as someone who hasn't watched the movie in a million years. I've watched scenes from it on YouTube when I was starting to do some research, and I was struck by, knowing what I know now about Eddie Cochran, I was struck by how little they even bothered to make Brian Setzer look specifically like Eddie Cochran. I mean, the clothes and the guitar don't match. And he's a blonde guy plays a Gretsch hollow body guitar. Who cares about the wood that it's made out of? Put him up there. There's some specs there. There's some choices when it comes to the way the guitar looked and the parts that were in it that are not period specific. I get that that's not first and foremost in anyone's mind. But it's interesting to me that they went as far as they did without thinking about or caring about those details. It's not necessary. I understand, but they went pretty far. They got really, really close. You could watch the footage on YouTube of the comparison. Kind of like if you had a period-specific movie that featured Michael Jackson performing, and the actor portraying him clearly is just doing Bruno Mars. It is Bruno Mars singing and dancing like Bruno Mars. It was the 80s. It was the 80s and nobody cared. I think similar to how I felt watching Great Balls of Fire and going, this performance is very off-putting. This is not the man I've been watching footage of and listening to interviews with by a long stretch. There's something, it's very exaggerated, but I can understand how Jerry Lee Lewis would have been insulted by that portrayal. But the rock and roll biography movie of the 80s was a many splendored thing. I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but they all tried in their own different ways, and that's why I say that Eddie and the Cruisers, please see my episodes on Eddie and the Cruisers back in the timeline, is one of the best rock and roll biographies because it's not trapped by having to be about an actual band or any actual people that actually existed. But it does have one of the greatest things about the 80s rock and roll movies, which is Joey Pantoliano being the guy behind the music and in a studio twiddling knobs. And in the case of Eddie and the Cruisers, he's a radio guy. But in the case of La Bamba, he's Bob Keane, helping make Ritchie a star and making him go through all those takes. That was a great one of the best devices in the whole thing is the montage of 25 takes of "Come on, let's go." I think a lot of movies tended to gloss over that part of the process, and maybe it's because Ritchie died so young that they didn't. They had the opportunity to really dig deep into the whole process in ways that a film about a big star that went on for decades didn't. And unlike a lot of music bio films that are almost always dramas, this one does the drama very well. The family drama and the romantic aspect of his life and the prejudice of his, the conflict with his girlfriend's dad and stuff. I think it's all very well woven into the music story. They don't sacrifice the personal for the musical. There's enough going on technically, from a rock and roll standpoint with the other artists that you see him touring with and having to deal with life on the road and what it was like back then and what those guys performed like on stage. In a general sense, is all portrayed, very compellingly, just like his personal life and his family life is portrayed very compellingly. I don't think I've ever heard anyone use the word compellingly. That leads me to believe it is not a word. It is a very compelling fashion. One thing I was struck by was how much information there is about Ritchie, especially via his family's website, and like any close family in the middle of the century that had cameras and was proud of their growing their growing family and proud of their kids. They took a lot of photos, and there's a book I'll dig into later that's very guitar-centric that documents all of the gear he ever used. Multiple amplifiers and guitars and microphone notes too. Very cool. I'm glad we have all this information about Ritchie. It warms my heart. What also warms my heart, and I was reading right before recording this and it started to get to me, so bear with me. I might have to punch out a few times. The words of Beverly Mendheim, who wrote Richie Valens, the first Latino rocker, and it came out in 1987. Interestingly enough, same time as La Bamba, the movie. This is sort of cited as the book you want to read if you want probably the best book about Ritchie. And she's got a way with words, and She starts the introduction. I mean, if I could, I would just read you her whole book, but I will jump in and out of it throughout the course of what I believe is going to be 2 episodes now that I'm going to split this up into. She does a great job of giving you the perspective of someone that's in the like young, like not a teenager yet, and when rock and roll is really hitting its stride. And I never get tired. I never get tired of the accounts from people who lived through this era. But she's a good enough writer that I don't want to always paraphrase what she's saying. I don't always want to put it in my own words. In the case, especially of the introduction, she talks about looking back on the year of 1958. She could see that Black Rhythm and Blues, renamed Rock and Roll by Alan Freed, a Cleveland disc jockey transplanted to New York, became whitewashed regardless of whether it was sung by Elvis Presley or Pat Boone. By 1958, it seemed to me that rock and roll was equally balanced, with black as well as white talent. I became a fervent viewer of Dick Clark's American Bandstand and Alan Freed's TV show. It was as much part of me as going to Mass on Sundays and occasional weekdays. Although my 11-year-old tastes still adhered to novelties such as The Witch Doctor, The Purple People Eater, and even the Chipmunk song, the airwaves were, fortunately, rich with teen idols who performed real rock and roll. And that is something I want to pause on for a second about this era. There's a lot of great garage rock and rockabilly and, jump blues and stuff predating this era of rock where it was starting to kind of crystallize in a lot of ways. That's really badass and raw, of course. But there's something equally wonderful about something she just said that I've never put it into words. I've never thought about it that way, but she's absolutely right. There are teen idols, but they still perform real rock and roll. And she names people like Bobby Darin, Jackie Wilson, the Everly Brothers, Dwayne Eddy, and Bobby Freeman, to name a few. And there was plenty of variety. Teen ballads, calypso, doo-wop, girl and boy duos, rockabilly, novelty, and for lack of a better term, just plain old rock and roll. And that statement is going to make me jump into the liner notes, the book that it came with I think it was 5 compact disc boxed set from Rhino Records that I bought in, must have been the early 2000s, called Loud, Fast, and Out of Control, The Wild Sounds of 50s Rock. And if you've never heard of it and never heard me talk about it on the show before, I am urging you now to go find some version of it, either streaming or physical media, or look up the track listing and find those songs individually somehow. Find a similar collection. I myself replaced some of the MP3 files that I had lost from that set via archive.org. Someone uploaded the whole thing, including the artwork. And this was well over a year and a half, 2 years ago, so I can't vouch for whether the link would still work, even if I shared it. But look for Loud, Fast, Out of Control, The Wild Sounds of 50s Rock, because it's just the best. It's just the best 50s rock collection I've ever seen. And it introduced me to so many wonderful artists I never could have heard otherwise. Anyways, they have an entry for every single track in this book. And for, I think it looks like it's on disc 1, track 12, Come On, Let's Go by Richie Valens. And this dovetails nicely into what Beverly Mandime was saying. And we'll get back to her words as well. In Richie Valens, rock and roll had one of its first... Hold it together, Jay. Gut-wrenching tragedies. Here was a Hispanic kid from a working-class suburb of Los Angeles who responded to the music's racially blind ideal, truncated his name from Valenzuela to Valens, and became an honest-to-God overnight success at 17. 4 months, 2 hits, 1 unreleased LP, and 1 movie later, he was dead. And the movie is not La Bamba. The movie is the one that I touched on in the Chuck Berry episode that he appears in and he sings on. We'll get more into that later. Because I forget if it's rock, or rock. It's not Rock Around the Clock, or it's whatever. Go Johnny Go. I think it's Go Johnny Go. And One movie later, he was dead in that immature, uncertain voice, in the untutored lyrics, and in the garagey production. Kids could hear much of themselves. This was music for and by kids. What set Valens apart was that he was, this is why this hurts. This is why I'm getting broken up. He was a guitar monster. The solo here is not only wonderfully lyrical, but it is also executed with blinding precision and confidence. And that's what we needed more of, in my opinion, from this era. And it's just such a hard blend to come across. A crooner with a really angelic voice, with enough rock and roll attitude so he's not a wuss, and a real strong guitar hand. A man who identifies with the electric guitar as much as he does the voice. It's usually varying ratios. Chuck Berry, more guitar than voice, I would say, is the way he portrayed himself. But having heard him sing Nat King Cole songs, I can tell you that he's got a sweet sounding croon that he didn't really put out a lot in the early days. If you are like me, your perception of the career of Lou Diamond Phillips is a little unfairly biased by his 80s output and his seemingly his drop-off from the public eye after that. But it turns out to not be the case at all. He did not drop off. He's never stopped working. He's done more recently, I'd say in the last 10, 15 years, it looks like he's very consistently been working in television and, long-term and independent movies. I just saw a trailer for a film that was put out by Lionsgate, direct to streaming and to disc, that also starred Mickey Rourke, and it's like a crime story. The main character is played by one of the dudes from the American Pie movies, I guess, and he's on parole, and he's getting in trouble with drugs, and he runs afoul of some gangstery stuff, and evidently Lou Diamond Phillips plays his like parole officer, something like that. It looked pretty compelling, actually. It looked like it was shot well. The music was good. The direction looked good. It was one of those one word titles like Severance or something like that. I've already forgotten what it was. But while he was promoting that, he did an interview in Salon in 2021. And I wanted to pull a little bit from that because they say they bring up his breakout roles were back in the late 80s with a string of commercial and critical hits. How did you see your career unfolding after such a forceful start? You had a bunch of Hollywood films, but also shifted into B movies like Adverse. Oh, maybe that's what it was. Adverse. Yes, that's the new one he's promoting. But I remember seeing him on the cover of VHS boxes for something like Thunderheart or whatever, where he was clearly like a sheriff or a guy with a badge on his belt, but it looked like it took place on a reservation. And then you stopped seeing him on the covers of VHS boxes after that. So I'm pleased to find out that he has been working steady for quite a while, and he didn't have any major controversy that prevented him from, working necessarily or something like that I didn't know about. They ask about, do you find that you wanted to have more control over your work, or was it difficult to find the work you wanted? And he says, I have to say that I've always felt fortunate because I've always been employed. I have been able to work as an actor or writer or director. And yeah, he does all that. Like he's definitely a man of many talents. From what I'm finding out now. Someone in my position doesn't get as many at-bats as some of my contemporaries do. That's a nice diplomatic way to say something. You don't get to have as wide a range of opportunity. careers are cyclical. As Jack Nicholson said, you get the highs, you get the lows. If you have a family and bills, this is what you do for a living, and you have to work. I've never been in a position where I could not work. So you take what's best that is offered to you, or the best you can get. When I like the opportunity to get the Tom Cruise role, they were not open to me. We were talking about the casual racism earlier. If I say, hey, I love this script, can I get a shot at it? They would say, hey, we're not going that way. I know what that meant. You never get an opportunity at that. When you don't, you have to make your own opportunities. I'm taking this role because I have bills to pay, but I will do it to the best of my ability. I will try to elevate the material. I will hold my head up high because I will hold up my end. There have been small films that have overachieved. People think of La Bamba and Stand and Deliver as great successes, and they are, but they were small films. La Bamba was a $6 million negative pickup. It was not a studio film. It was essentially an independent film that was guaranteed distribution. Stand and Deliver was made for $1 million originally by PBS and picked up by Warner Brothers at the Mill Valley Film Festival. I made The 33 with Patricia Riggin, and it was undersold and it underperformed. It had a Mexican-American director and the most international cast I've ever worked with, and yet it didn't get the kind of support that would have put it into the awards consideration it should have been. I'm a member of the Academy, and they didn't even send out screeners. They're putting labels on things and making boxes smaller. My entire career has been fighting against those labels. There'll be a link in the description of this episode to the Salon article if you want to read it in its entirety. But there's another interesting part where he recounts situations like, well, I'm up for a role, the interviewer didn't, I think, do a very good job of getting him to expand on what he's saying. So you can read it yourself and see if you think I'm interpreting it correctly, because he's speaking very casually and in these not in a lot of detail, and he's basically saying, there's been instances where, for example, he'd be up for a role that's dependent upon the race of the person they're casting in the lead. So in one case, it was, well, if we pick a white actor to play the lead, you can play the supporting character. And they ended up picking an African-American actor for the lead. So they said, well, then we wanted a white guy for the supporting character instead. So it was very much we can't have two guys that aren't white in front of the camera most of the time. Sort of a situation is what he seems to be relating. Personally, I always feel like, unless you're telling a story that's specific to an ethnicity or a region of the world, especially if it's historical, then why couldn't Lou Diamond? There's no reason why Lou Diamond Phillips could not have played the kind of character Tom Cruise generally has played in his career. For example, I could have, you pick who you want to pick as far as the best actor for the role, right? But if Tom Cruise is the same actor and looked like Lou Diamond Phillips, I don't think that takes anything away from Legend or Top Gun or any of the Mission Impossible films I still haven't seen. Okay, I'm not much of a Tom Cruise guy, but same thing. I think Tom Cruise is a weird one for me to zero in on because he mentioned it, but Tom Cruise has a weird, he has a quality about him that makes it, I think directors like Tom Cruise he doesn't have much of an identity or personality the way a lot of other actors tend to carve out, like a Schwarzenegger or a Clint Eastwood. You can't imagine anyone doing those roles besides them. And I know those are, not necessarily mainstream actors, especially not in the modern day. But yeah. I don't think most of us would have had a problem with someone that looked like Lou Diamond Phillips playing most of the parts that we've seen the average white actor, the average non-muscle bound, white actor doing in a lot of films. I think that's a credit to us, the audience, and it's a discredit to the people that make all these decisions because they tend to overthink a lot of things. And like rock critics, they tend to think they speak for a populace that they're very out of touch with. When it comes to race and representation in films, Those are the opinions I feel I'm actually qualified to throw out there. Beyond that, I'm not that well educated. I would just say that I think Lou Diamond Phillips has displayed enough acting chops that you could have dropped a lot of less talented white guys out of movies I've seen and put him in, and he would have elevated those films. And the race and ethnicity of the actor in question would not have affected the story at all, or made it less accurate or less believable. And Lou Diamond Phillips has won a lot of awards apparently for his acting, which is really cool. It's kind of starting with Stand and Deliver in '88 with Edward James Olmos. He was nominated for Golden Globe for supporting actor. He won the Independent Spirit Award for Best Supporting Male. And then after that, and La Bamba and obviously Young Guns playing Chavez, Mexican Greaser, Navajo. He does the sequel to Young Guns and then starts getting into Broadway in '96. He makes a Broadway debut in The King and I, playing the King. Late '90s, he didn't really do apparently a lot movie-wise. There was a comedy action called The Big Hit, and he was playing next to Mark Wahlberg. But boy, oh boy, talk about mediocre white guys. That's a personal opinion. But he'd go on to show up in the George Lopez sitcom in the early 2000s. He would show up in 24 as a government agent with former Young Guns co-star Kiefer Sutherland, which is great. He did, oh my gosh. He got to be on a reality show with Tori Wilson of the WWE. Yowza. He won the second season of that series, I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. But he got to be hanging around Tori Wilson. Anyway, he goes on to do more touring. He did King Arthur in Lerner and Loewe's Camelot live, and was on Stargate Universe for a while on the Sci-Fi Channel in the 09 to 11, 2010s, Food Network appearances. Then in 2012 he starts a supporting role on Longmire. So that was, I think, his bread and butter for a little while there. And then he was in the Imagine Dragons music video for Radioactive. Ew. I mean, I'm sure he was great in it. But then in 2014, he goes back to play the King of Siam in The King and I, but this time at the Melbourne, Australia Opera. And after that, just little stuff here and there. TV, movies, and poker. He did poker championships in that era of the 2000s where that was unfortunately on TV all the time and everywhere. Obviously not my thing, but he's a poker dude and has done well in various tournaments, I guess. Also an activist when it comes to being on the advisory council of the Coalition of Asian Pacifics in Entertainment. He has organized benefits like the concert The Winds of Life for Native American causes because he's still close to the Lakota Sioux family that eventually adopted him. He's also a member of the Canadian charity Artists Against Racism, and he's appeared in LGBTQ equality campaigns as well. And his awards start in 1989 and they go up through, the early 2000s. Lots of cool stuff. But as mentioned before, he's also like a writer. He was in one interview, he was talking about adapting a friend's series of books into a mini series and working with his wife on a writing project. And all during this, his filmography starts in 1984 and goes all the way through 2024 as a voice actor on Justice League Crisis on Infinite Earths. He's Owlman and Spectre. Oh, and speaking of comic books, he was also in an Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Not in one, he directed one. and he directed an episode of Fear of the Walking Dead. And yeah, you look at his television career, and it starts in 1984. Again, goes straight through to 2023 when he appeared on The Masked Singer. Okay, that's not really... Well, yes, that is acting. Any way you slice it, the guy is a success. I love it. And there's a lot of guys that have worked, consistently in or around Hollywood for the better part of their career that didn't do any breakout stuff like he did in the 80s, so that didn't have any quotable lines that we remember to this day. So I'd say Lou Diamond Phillips, awesome career. Nothing to feel sorry for the guy about, really, when you look at what he's done. No weird sex tape stuff. No recordings of him drunk, calling a cop some sort of racial slur, thankfully, or anything like that other people have done. No crackpot spiritual evangelism either. We should all aspire to bring out the Lou Diamond Phillips in all of us. Today's episode is brought to you by Radish Mattress. Radish Mattress. What do you sleep on? Is it radishes? And if not, why? Now back to some more of the words of Beverly Mannheim. She says it was an early evening in September 1958 when she tuned into the Alan Freed radio show on WINS in her tenement apartment in the central Bronx. A song came on that was to change my life in a very special way. It was customary among my schoolmates at the fairly integrated, meaning racially integrated with black and white people, I would assume, probably New York, also Puerto Rican, that she attended to play a guessing game about whether a new song that came out by a singer or group was sung by blacks or whites. We were 7th and 8th graders, and the majority of us who were black or Puerto Rican were hardly fooled by an increasing effort on the part of white performers to sound as colored as possible. In the beginning, Bobby Darin had many of us guessing. Indeed, that memorable night when I first heard the song Come On, Let's Go by Richie Valens, I was deeply puzzled. He sounded neither black nor white. I love that. I love that because it just indicates his originality. He's not trying to sound like a white guy. He's not trying to sound like a black guy. He's doing his own thing. And because you haven't heard a Chicano voice singing rock and roll, a naturally Chicano rock and roll singer, you don't know how to categorize it. He said, since I had been exposed extensively to Latin music, I could detect a certain Latin quality in his singing, and I suspected that he just might be Spanish. My puzzlement was not resolved when I saw him performed on American Bandstand. For what I saw was an obviously heavy-set white boy, because it's black and white TV, and those lights are pretty, strong in the studio. It washes out a lot of gradient, I would say, when you look at that old footage. A few of what then was considered to be Hispanic features, although a later picture in a fan magazine once again aroused my suspicion, not to mention Ritchie's second release was an obviously Latin song, La Bamba. Nobody was saying a word, and unless one was from the Southern California area, no one knew that Richie Valens was of Mexican-American heritage, not until after his death. I remember 2 Hispanic schoolmates arguing in the schoolyard about whether Ritchie was Spanish, meaning that his family was originally from Spain, or Mexican, meaning originally from Mexico. This clandestine attitude of the 50s gave way to later writings that Valens was of Mexican Indian heritage, which is not altogether correct. To say that the fair-complexioned, hazel-eyed boy who often wore his dark hair in a perfect 50s waterfall was mestizo, as is true of most people of Mexican heritage, would have been more correct. Furthermore, as far as I can remember, Ritchie never sang La Bamba on American Bandstand, nor the Dick Clark Show, the Saturday Show, nor even the more liberal Alan Freed weekly TV show. even though La Bamba reached number 22 on the Billboard charts, while on the flip side, Donna went all the way to number 2. The two-sided release was considered a double-sided hit, a rare occurrence in rock music even to this day. La Bamba was also not performed at the Christmas show of 1958, held at the Lowe's State Theater in New York, where by chance I had the opportunity to see Valens in person. I remember being truly amazed at the beauty of his voice when he sang this simple teen ballad Donna, which he had composed. Unlike many of my contemporaries, I never fell head over heels for a teen idol. That is, not until I saw Richie Valens. It was during The Music Shop, a Sunday variety TV show hosted by Buddy Bregman, January 17, 1959, that I became infatuated with Valens and saw that he was much too talented to go unrecognized. I am such a sucker for hearing people talk about like their youthful crushes and what it indicates about that person. I think it's always, if someone has a reason for telling that story, I find it very heartwarming, because someone like this always has a good sort of handle on, okay, why does this person stand out from the pack? I mean, there's tons of teen idols, tons of clean cut, nice boys with big smiles, and plenty that could sing, right? But I love the fact that she recognized, no, this is way too special. And also, a lot of those other guys weren't writing their own songs, right? I would say probably most, if not nearly all, the guys that were there to cater to the underage, prepubescent girls, the ones they had to, be nice for, so that their very judgmental parents would allow them to purchase the 45 RPM singles of said teen idols. Later on in the introduction, she says, why is Richie Valens important? In addition to the fact that he was actually the very first successful Chicano rock and roller, the music he produced made him the father of Latin Chicano rock. Indeed, some of his contributions, which until now have remained fairly unknown, extend beyond his being the father of a music. Remember, this came out in 1987, this book. His music was one of the first to combine elements of rock and jazz. Ritchie was, along with Duane Eddy and Eddie Cochran, a developer of the garage band sound, actually originating with Bo Diddley, which contributed to what later became known as surf music. He was one of the first rockers to use the idea of a medley of melodies within a song, often called through composed in traditional music circles. That's something I've never heard, but I didn't make it past 1 year of music theory in community college. What can I tell you? But I wonder if there's another term for that nowadays that people use, or if it was always called that. And he was one of the first to use asymmetrical rhythms and pentatonic 5-tone melodies, previously confined to black urban blues. Amazingly, all of this making of musical history was accomplished through a few songs and song fragments that barely filled 3 albums in a period of less than 8 months by a 17-year-old boy. Now, before I get too much farther away from the film aspect of this episode, let us jump to an article published August 13, 1987 from the Los Angeles Times. La Bamba lip-synced for success. And I'm not going to just read the whole thing verbatim. You can look it up if you like, but I'm going to read what I found to be more important stuff, more interesting stuff about the making of the film. It talks about, a lot of news interest in the new movie coming out because it has been a popular sort of event for the Latino film-going audience in America due to it being dubbed in a Spanish language version and put in theaters. They note this is a wise marketing decision and one that is certain to launch a trend in the American film industry. But the dubbing process, the using of voice actors to re-record dialogue in Spanish, is hardly the technical story of La Bamba. Of course, this is the kind of thing they did in other countries plenty of times. I mean, that's why one of the best movies ever made is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly by Sergio Leone, starring Clint Eastwood and Lee Van Cleef and Eli Wallach. there are actors in that film that are American, Italian, Spanish, and other nationalities, and everyone basically just speaks their own language. So, you know, if you only spoke Spanish, you couldn't really talk to the American actors, and if you only spoke Italian, you couldn't talk to the Spanish actors or the American actors, that kind of a thing. So it's dubbed. It's all redubbed. The whole thing in multiple different languages from multiple different countries releases. So, you know, it just depends character by character what they had to reinterpret their mouth movements into to get across the same kind of sentiment in another language in the same amount of time that person's mouth is moving. Anyway, the idea that it took until 1987 for an American company to just basically see the marketing value in this and see the financial value in hiring the people to do this is kind of an interesting thing. The idea that, you know, they weren't dubbing things for the Spanish language markets up until this point on a regular basis is something I hadn't really thought about, because I think we just sort of take for granted now that when you're streaming something, you can just select what language you want. Ever since the DVD era, you've been able to select multiple languages for a rewatch of any film, generally that was put out during a certain modern era. Anyhow, they praised the seemingly error-free lip-syncing of the star Lou Diamond Phillips throughout this biographical film. He appears in close-up shots singing Valens' songs. The voice is actually that of David Hidalgo of Los Lobos, the contemporary group that re-recorded most of Valens' hits. But only Hidalgo and the filmmaking crew would know the words aren't coming out of Phillips' mouth. They praise him for having no musical background and deserving a lot of credit for getting his singing and his guitar strumming lined up well with the music. He got a lot of help, though. There's a quote that says, "An actor can only go so far with lip syncing. He can get you in the ballpark," said Curt Sobel, music editor on La Bamba. Lou did a great job. He practiced constantly, but when everything was shot, there was still a lot of work to do. They note he's 33 years old, Sobel, and a freelance editor who has worked on movies like White Knights and Eddie and the Cruisers. There we go, folks. If you haven't heard the Eddie and the Cruisers episodes of A History of Rock and Roll and Film and Rock and Roll, check them out after this. I don't think you'll be disappointed, unless you despise Eddie and the Cruisers. In that case, I don't know, you might be disappointed. Listen to them anyway. Yell at your podcast machine while you hear me extol the virtues of Eddie and the Cruisers and get emotional in some places about how good the story is in the book. So check those Eddie and the Cruisers episodes out, please. Especially even if you hate that movie, because then you could yell at your podcast machine and say,
my podcast machine is like the kind of mangy cat, like dropping the dead bird. Look at that. What about that? I don't want it. I don't want it.
But Sobel and a guitar instructor were on the set during every musical scene with Lou Diamond Phillips, coaching him along the way and advising the director as to which takes were the most in sync with the music overall. And he says that on the set it was Lou singing and strumming to pre-recorded Los Lobos music, usually a verse at a time. I gotta say, a verse at a time is pretty freaking good for someone without a musical background. They shoot all these scenes from different angles, so Phillips, didn't have to be perfectly in sync for long stretches of a song, and the music and film editors could patch numbers together from a series of short bursts. But the actual synchronization of the performance with the music was done frame by frame in the editing room, says Sobel. The lips and voice are never perfectly synchronized. You have to find the exact spot where the actor begins a word and put the beginning of the music right there. He doesn't go into too much technical detail for us, unfortunately, but he talks about they have a little ability to shorten or stretch the music to fit the movements of the actor and his mouth or his guitar playing. I'm curious about that, what they were doing in 87 to sort of stretch things a little bit. That's interesting. I just picture someone in an editing bay with like a big wheel and just like turning it to the right to speed things up and turning it to the left to like a steering wheel or something. Big crank, maybe. They have the vocals on the songs on the soundtrack and every instrument from Los Lobos separated. So they have all the basic tracks to manipulate individually. So he can kind of do a lot of manipulating to kind of make the, help the synchronicity of everything, which is must have been a really nice luxury for them. It says, when Valens was recording in 1958, the singers' voices were not routinely isolated as they are now. As the LA Times, so I guess they assume that their audience knows a little bit about audio production and how music is recorded in the modern era. They seem to be kind of taking that knowledge for granted. It says, that's the reason the original recordings were not used in the movie. Without a voice track, Sobel wouldn't have been able to shape the real Valens voice to Phillips's lips. Sobel says, we got the cleanest versions of the songs we could, but it was clear they weren't going to work for stereo theaters. I told Luis Valdez and producer Taylor Hackford that if you use Ritchie's music, whatever Lou does, that's it. I can't fix it. Yeah, and I'm sure that's why Jerry Lee Lewis re-recorded his songs for, Great Balls of Fire. I don't remember the 3 years ago when I recorded those first episodes of A History of Rock and Roll, Film and Rock and Roll, if I bring that up specifically. But, I mean, you can't imagine going to a theater with like DTS Dolby sound in the mid-late 80s or something like that, whatever they were using, and you're going to be taken totally out of the film as soon as Lou Diamond Phillips steps up to a microphone and you start hearing the audio crackling of a vinyl record recording, or a tape hiss from 1958. Oh, come on, let's go. That's really loud. That's going to be, hard to deal with. So, of course, you're going to re-record them. He says, we didn't know how the scenes would be edited later, so Lou had to learn all 30 versions and practice them. Oh, sorry, I missed. I actually scrolled down while I was talking. This is about the scene where he's doing like 30 takes of Come On, Let's Go with Joey Pantoliano. This is hilarious. I loved that, even as a kid. I did not know how true that scene was until I got older. Good Lord. So they changed the musical phrasing and the wording different every time. Some versions were made up in Sobel's studio of bits and pieces from the others. He says after Lou Diamond learned all 30 versions, we cut up the number of versions to 18. 7 were finally used in the movie. We made up cue cards for each one, and he sent them through each take. I sat below the microphone holding up cue cards. That's great. Yeah, it was one nightmarishly long day, says the text. And ended late in the evening with Phillips completing his one successful take of the final full-length song, a version that appears in the film. When you see it, pay attention to Phillips's beaming smile at the end of the session. It was genuine. He'd been doing it over and over, says Sobel, and there's always something that wasn't quite right. When he did the last one, he knew we had hit it. We all did. So one tricky lip sync they had to do was a scene where Richie calls Donna on the phone and sings the song to her through the receiver. And they thought that'll be the one where we'll just record Lou Diamond Phillips actually singing, and it just didn't match well enough with what you were hearing from his character throughout the whole rest of the movie. So they actually did have the singer from Los Lobos watch the phrasing on the take visually and sing along to those movements in that scene for the soundtrack that they then replaced where the audio would have been of Lou Diamond Phillips singing in the phone booth. There's some really cool notes about Curt Sobel's career. He has worked as a music editor or music supervisor on a billion projects. I mean, and a lot of stuff that people would be very familiar with, like Ray, The Bourne Ultimatum, Finding Neverland, I Am Sam, Evolution, X-Men, the original one from 2000. Let's see what else. Donnie Brasco. PCU. That's one we got to cover someday. I know Steve Vai did soundtrack music for that. I don't know if I need to do more Steve Vai episodes. I mean, going backwards from there, I want to try to see what the early stuff is. Wise Blood in 1979. Also title of a fantastic album by Corrosion of Conformity. I can't recommend enough. Tarzan the Ape Man in 1981. Risky Business, Eddie and the Cruisers, Razor's Edge, Starman, hell yes. Good old John Carpenter. That young Sherlock Holmes, the Money Pit. Can't say that without hearing it in Peter's voice from Family Guy. The Golden Child, probably one of my favorite movies of all time as a little kid. Monster Squad. He was on Hail Hail Rock and Roll, the Chuck Berry documentary that I'm using for Chuck Berry research and have used. Dolores Claiborne, a little Stephen King action there. Also, we've got the Bedazzled remake with, sexy lady Elizabeth Hurley and nice young man Brendan Fraser. Going further up, if I get closer to the modern era, the Get On Up, the James Brown biopic, the Fantastic Four movie that came out in 2015 that got a lot of attention, but good and bad. The Valley Girl remake, Ghostbusters Afterlife, and the newest thing is something called 13 the Musical. So, good work, Mr. Sobel. Thank you for your service. Let's move to an academic exercise. Shall we? Yes, shall. Let's look up the dictionary definition of Richie Valens. And by dictionary, I mean Edwards' History of Rock and Roll, Volume 1, 1920 to 1963. By definition, I mean whatever I can find in the index under Valens, Ritchie. Well, it turns out it's Jack Squat, basically. A little bit more than Jack Squat. First of all, it's not spelled correctly. It's Valen, Ritchie. Pages 202 to 205. And guess what that is? It's an account of the so-called Day the Music Died, involving everyone that took part in it and the aftermath in a very short space of those few pages, and Ritchie is barely even mentioned. He does wrap it up by saying, despite the words of a popular song written years later, this wasn't, quote, the day the music died, unquote, but an unpleasant moment in an evolution that was already underway. The actual replacement of Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, and the Big Bopper by Bobby V, Frankie Avalon, and Jimmy Clanton was also symbolic. Had they lived, Richardson would no doubt have continued an already thriving career as a country singer. Valens might have had a further career, especially if he could have freed himself of Bob Keane, who was still an amateur player despite having a few hits with Sam Cooke. That's kind of fair. And Holly might have balanced to the string-laced Gordon Jenkins Pop Productions Decca was saddling him with, and future recordings with the Crickets, had they been able to come to terms. Doesn't give you much of anything when it comes to Ritchie's rise to fame or his life story or his background. So I will go instead to Rock of Ages, the Rolling Stone History of Rock and Roll, written by Ed Ward, again, Jeffrey Stokes and Ken Tucker. And in the Ed Ward section, the first third of it, in chapter 12, Tragedy, he does talk about Ritchie in much more detail. So evidently in the 80s, when this book came out, not in the 2020s when the previous book came out, he thought more of Ritchie. He thought enough of Ritchie to add details in a much shorter book. If I'm considering his first third of the book, like the Edward section, it's its own thing. But I said dictionary and definition because Ed Ward is like my go-to for actual historical account, black and white, what happened in rock and roll history at any given time. It's not necessarily fun to read. If you want that, I've said many times, just get Nick Toshi's Unsung Heroes of Rock and Roll, read it cover to cover, and then go from there into other books as you like. But if you really want to know what birthed rock and roll, I mean, that's the most compelling, exciting, badass and still well-written book I think you can get, full of attitude and full of research. But with Ed Ward, you gotta just go. I mean, the guy just tracked everything, so you got to jump constantly from artist to artist, from gig to gig, from single release to single release, to record label popping up to record label closing down, all in the span of like one page at a time. Like all those things are constantly happening, so it's a lot. It's not great storytelling. It shouldn't be. Obviously, it's history. But in the book he put out in the 80s, he talks about how Ritchie was you know, one of the most proud Mexican Americans in rock and roll, in entertainment, let alone rock and roll. It said, even if on his records he had to change his name from Valenzuela so that disc jockeys could pronounce it, Mexican Americans had been rock and roll fans from the start, providing Johnny Otis with some of his hottest audiences, both at the Barrel House back when Watts was as much brown as black, and when he started staging shows especially for them at El Monte Legion Stadium in the heart of brown L.A. First, jump blues, then vocal group music formed the soundtrack for the Pachucos, bad boys cruising Whittier Boulevard in the cars they'd so lovingly restored and polished. But there had never been a Mexican-American rock and roll star. And now Richie Valens, 17 years old, good-looking, if a bit chubby, and possessed of a fine high tenor voice and a natural fluid songwriting ability, was the obvious candidate. That, I think, is great history writing. You know, you've got a sense of the scene, you've got a sense of the background, you've got a sense of what musical trends had been moving things along before Ritchie, you know, came onto the scene. Pretty cool. And it goes into talking about, you know, Bob Keane, recognizing his potential, goes into him being, you know, the first major artist on Delphi Records with Keane. He debuted with Come On, Let's Go. And it's sounded like a folk song, but it was as light and danceable as the rest of as the best of Buddy Holly. For his second record, Ritchie mined his Mexican heritage for a more ambitious song, which was released toward the end of 1958. La Bamba was almost a pan-Latin folk song based on an incredible riff that a guitarist would play over and over as the singer improvised verses, usually nonsense lyrics, but sometimes sly satires. Perhaps there was a double meaning to the lines, yo no soy marinero, soy capitán, meaning, I'm not a sailor, I'm a captain. I always wondered if it was more specific, like my name is, like I am not a mariner, I am the captain, or if it was like, don't call me a mariner, call me your captain. All Ritchie did was add a killer rhythm section and a fine electric lead guitar, and La Bamba became the biggest foreign language smash since Volare. And I don't know if that's how you pronounce Volare. Volare. And to clinch his success, the B-side was a tribute to all the late-night dances he'd ever played. Yeah, here's where I break with Ed Ward. Right here. Donna would never win any prizes for lyrics, but nobody would be listening to its words. It had the perfect creeping tempo for slow, passionate dancing. All right, buddy. Let's take a minute here. Screw you, Ed Ward. The lyrics to Donna are perfect for that song, for that pacing, for that composition, that teen touching and squeezing, dance slow and close kind of a thing. It is aching and romantic in its simplicity. It doesn't need to freaking be Bob Dylan. All these Rolling Stone guys, I swear to Christ. Like, if it's not Bob Dylan or Bruce Springsteen or Elvis Costello, they've got nothing to say, nothing nice or smart or incisive to say about anyone's lyric writing. That's why I keep going on and on and on about how great Lester Bangs and Nick Toshis are as rock writers. God, they were so good. They're opinionated as hell. And you don't have to, it doesn't take you out of the flow of the language to disagree if you disagree with them. You don't care because they're dragging you along for the ride, whether you like it or not. The 80s, I swear to God, is the era that we gave way too much cultural power to two different kinds of people, hairdressers and music critics, okay? And they didn't deserve it, and they made life hell for everybody. We let the people in salons or whatever, people that did hairstyling just took over culture and decided everything needed to come up. It had to come away from the shoulders for everybody, evidently, and go out and up more. And it had to be the most high maintenance thing possible because, of course, it's in their best interest to keep you coming back. every couple of weeks, because if you have a really hard to maintain hairstyle, well, then it looks like crap after it grows out a little bit, right? We as a culture allowed them to have way too much sway over where things are going. And same with rock critics. That was the last era, I think, where there was a lot of, they could make a lot of money, sell books and magazines, and try to be the taste makers and try to dictate where culture was supposed to go. Luckily, enough people broke off from Rolling Stone in the 70s and formed Cream magazine, and young people just started doing their own fanzines in the DIY era of punk rock, and college radio started getting more influential in the 80s instead of these critics. Jeez. Donna is perfect. I'm saying that as a person who's only a casual, beg your pardon, easy for me to say, casual listener of Richie Valens. I've enjoyed every single thing I've heard, but I haven't listened to his entire catalog. And I can tell you that, one of the greatest rock and roll songs of all time is Bebop-A-Lula by Gene Vincent. And that's not going to win any prizes for lyrics either, Ed. I think it was Steve Allen famously read the lyrics of that song out loud on his television program to expose to the chuckling parents in the audience just how stupid this new caveman music rock and roll was. Because the point is, you mix it with the beat and the bass line, and it is a very compelling song. Just like you do with Donna, a nice mid-tempo ballad, kind of love ballad that, it's a perfect format for something with lyrics that are that simple and earnest. It's good to sometimes leave things open to the imagination for young people, especially. He had a girl, Donna was her name, and since she left him, he's never been the same. But he loves his girl and wants to know where she is. That's enough. It's enough. It's perfection. It's, here's what I had. Now it's gone. I don't even need to tell you. I can't even tell you in detail how it makes me feel. I've just never been the same person since. And you sing Oh Donna like 8 times in a row. It's magical. And baby, that's rock and roll. Curse you, Ed Ward. Curse you. That's all I'm going to spend reading your words today during this particular edit. Now, I want to cut to audio recorded way back last year for the Patreon episodes that I decided to utilize, because the Patreon stuff is a lot more reading directly from the page on some sources. And this is one where I had a book from the library, had to get it back in a short period of time, and it had a pretty concise timeline of Richie Valens' life. Written from the point of view of, a sort of a guitar-centric point of view of from this particular historian. So I decided to let the Patreon audience have it a lot sooner because I knew I wasn't going to finish the Richie Valens episode for a long time. That's what a lot of podcasters do with their Patreon stuff. Myself, this is the only material I have ever treated this way. You've never heard anything on the main feed. I don't recall, anyway, in my mind, that was done earlier on the Patreon. Now, you're not going to hear me just reading the book all the way through. I'm going to break it up into 2 sections at least, and I think you'll enjoy it. I think this guy did a great job. If you're a guitarist and you specifically want to check out, a pretty slim little book that covers a lot of great information on Richie and his gear. Like every guitar or amp he ever touched is documented in this. And I highly recommend it. If you want to check it out, I'll start talking about it here as we cut to my old audio from last year now. So this is present day Jay signing off and handing it to the ghost of rock and roll recordings past. Ghost of a history of rock and roll and film and rock and roll recordings past. Jay, take it away now, midstream. Beep. Click. That's the sound. That's the sound of me hitting the machine that goes beep and click, which then sets the time-space continuum track off of where we are now. Although I'm still talking to you, so I guess I didn't get the timing right. But to back then, I'll try. I'll hit it. I'll push it harder, and I'll hold it down longer this time. Beep, click. But what I do have in my hands, and have had for months on my living room floor, is a guitar book by Ryan Sheeler, Richie Valens, His Guitars and Music. And it's got transcriptions for a couple of tunes, and there's a lot of technical information about every single guitar that he has ever been pictured with and recorded with or played on stage. And there's a really nice sort of section of a few pages that is just about Ritchie before it gets into the more technical stuff, and then the more musical stuff and the sheet music and things. And I just want to read it. Now, some of this is going to get chopped up and used for the upcoming Richie Valens episode whenever I get that done. I've got another Van Halen episode at least to do. First, another Little Richard episode. And I don't know how soon I'll get to Richie Valens. Also thinking about doing Back to the Beach, but that's a whole big can of bags of worms. For how much of that I want to focus on surf music as it exists in guitar history, and how much I want to spend on Stevie Ray Vaughan, which is because he appears in that film. And I just wanted to use it as a jumping off point to talk about the history of Stevie Ray Vaughan and his life. So what I'm saying to you as a patron of this bonus feed is what you're going to hear now is me reading straight from the book for the most part. I might spin a couple of things my own way, and that's coming to you sooner than it will the main feed in its entirety. And when it hits the main feed, it'll be edited, it'll be chopped up, and some of this will be unused. And I feel like that's a decent trade-off. If not, call in and call the customer service line, and we will take your customer service complaints under advisement. Chapter 1, Richie Valens, his story. There are a few fine biographies of Richie Valens in various books. The best is Beverly Mendheim's excellent Richie Valens, the First Latino Rocker. Hers was the first full-length biography about Richie. I have corresponded at length with Beverly about Richie and his guitars for this project, and she has been very gracious in helping me with this project. As any musician, historian, or musicologist will tell you, music, or any art for that matter, does not exist in a vacuum. It is best not to separate the study of art from the culture in which it was created. I think we can safely all agree with the man based on what we've covered and how we've covered it here at A History of Rock and Roll and in Film and Rock and Roll. Music is not only the product of God-given talent, nurturing, and hard work, but it is also a product of the environment and of the times. Heck yeah, it sure is, I say. Your narrator says that, not the author. Richard Stephen Valenzuela was born May 13, 1941 at Los Angeles County Osteopathic Hospital north of downtown Los Angeles to Joseph Steve, and Concepcion Reyes Valenzuela. His father worked as a miner, ranch hand, cowboy, and tree surgeon, and had a mining accident which left him hurt severely. Richie's parents separated when he around 3 years old. I assume there's a was that needs to be in there. And he lived with his father in Pacoima. His father encouraged young Richie's burgeoning musical talents by having him take up the guitar and singing. Young Richie was very shy, but his father was stern but loving in encouragement. Richie's father was sick much of the time with diabetes and several other ailments and passed away in 1951. What happened next after Richie's father's death is slightly difficult to track and varies from source to source. It is held commonly that Richie's mother moved into Steve's house in Pacoima with her older son from a previous marriage, Bob Morales. and Richie's younger sisters, Connie and Irma. There's some confusion as to the general timing of these events. Some accounts have Ritchie staying with other relatives till he was approximately 11 years old or so. He spent a lot of time with his aunt and uncle, Ernestine and Lalo Reyes. His relationship with them would continue well into his famous years and would be proven to be a pivotal influence in Ritchie's life. A rather fortuitous byproduct of living with his relatives and extended family is that this environment helped encourage Ritchie's innate talent for music. He was encouraged in his music by relatives on his mother's and father's sides of the family. There's varying information on how Ritchie got started with the guitar. He had an early cigar box guitar that may have been made by one of his relatives. His cousin, Dickie Cota, taught him guitar chords and some traditional Mexican songs, including La Bamba. An uncle, John Lozano, is mentioned as giving Ritchie some guidance on the guitar as well. And his Aunt Ernestine mentioned another relative giving Ritchie a guitar. As he began to grow in his love for guitars, he would practice long hours and sing and play to his younger sisters. He developed a love for the guitar very quickly and played it every chance he got. Pacoima Junior High School, now Pacoima Middle School, opened its doors in 1954, and Ritchie entered as a 7th grader. By this time, Ritchie had started to carry his guitar, an off-white Harmony acoustic, to class, where he would play and sing between classes and for various informal gatherings. He had taken a liking to woodshop class and had also bought a cheap Harmony H44 Stratotone. No pictures exist of this guitar with its original paint finish, but it is well known that Ritchie refinished his guitar to a dark green in woodshop class. And somewhere along the way, he picked up a secondhand guitar amp. An amplifier of unknown model, likely some type of Sears or Montgomery Ward, or small Fender Champ. He also began to develop a taste for rock and roll and R&B of that early period. Early Little Richard, Chuck Berry, and Bo Diddley, and other R&B and early rock performers, including doo-wop groups such as the Penguins, Orioles, Robins, later Coasters. If you haven't heard much of the Coasters, I strongly recommend you pause, go look up the song Charlie Brown, go re-listen to Yakety Yak, which you've definitely heard, and then Down in Mexico. Lesser-known groups such as the Medallions and Robert and Johnny, We Belong Together, which Ritchie would later cover himself. Of historical note, in January 1957, there was a mid-air plane collision that occurred in Pacoima, approximately over the grounds of Pacoima Junior High School. A Douglas DC-7B collided with a U.S. Air Force Northrop F-89 Scorpion in midair over the San Fernando Valley. Wreckage from the Douglas DC-7B rained down on the school playground of Pacoima Junior High School. The crew and several school children were killed and scores more injured. Ritchie was not in school that day. He was away attending a family funeral for his maternal grandfather, Frank Reyes. By most accounts, this incident, along with seeing planes fly too close to the roads in the valley, had frightened Ritchie. Ritchie entered San Fernando High School as a sophomore in the fall of 1957. In those days, high schools were often only 3 grades instead of the 4 common today. That fall, he joined up with a group of musicians that called themselves the Silhouettes. It has been said that Ritchie started the group, but this is commonly held as false, since the group was active in the neighborhood before Ritchie joined. Gil Rocha was the leader of the group, although historical accounts vary between his accounts and that of Bill Jones, another member. The Silhouettes, with Gil and Ritchie and a slightly variable core group, played dances in the San Fernando Valley from the fall of 1957 to May of 1958. They played all over the area, at the San Fernando American Legion, San Fernando High School, Pacoima Recreation Park, and elsewhere. Completely self-taught, but with an obvious natural talent and aptitude for music, Ritchie was making a name for himself playing guitar at school functions, and most anywhere they would let him play. He had been dubbed Little Richard of the Valley because of his love for Little Richard, or Ritchie and his crying guitar because of his love of bending the guitar strings. Gil wanted him to bring some blues to the band, so Ritchie bought an early version of Big Baby Blues, or brought in a version, and soon gained his crying guitar nickname because of his love of the string-bending blues guitar technique. His mother was struggling financially to support Ritchie and Bob, though Bob eventually moved out, along with the younger sisters Connie and Irma and newborn brother Mario. Richie's mother had a pension from Steve's death and supplemented her income as a waitress in order to raise money to help the family. In May 1958, Ritchie and his mom decided to throw a dance party at the Pacoima Legion Hall that would feature Ritchie and the band. Gil Rocha taped the show and gave the tape to a friend, Doug Macchia, who also worked for Bob Keane, or Keane, with E-E-N-E, as opposed to E-A-N-E, original name Bob Kuhn, K-U-H-N, helping him with his printing needs and business cards. Keane opened a small independent record label, Delphi Records, out of Los Angeles, just a short time later in a matter of weeks. Keane was able to see that Ritchie was playing a local amateur talent show and gathering at the old Rennie's Theater in San Fernando, later to be renamed the Crest Theater, and then El Azteca. Ritchie stood up on the theater stage before the matinee on a Saturday morning, playing his guitar through a small second-hand little amp, most likely a Fender Champ. See Chapter 2. And in entertaining a gathering of his friends and classmates. Ritchie had won 2 of these shows in a row, and the third time Bob Keane came to see Ritchie. Keane sat in the back and was very impressed with the energetic young boy and thought about getting him to record. Keane spoke with a shy Ritchie briefly and gave him a business card and thought nothing more of it. Thankfully, Ritchie followed up on the meeting and went out to Keane's home studio, bringing some friends with him, friends from the Silhouettes, specifically. Keane had a small studio in his home. In that small space, he had an Ampex 6012 reel-to-reel, 2-track stereo recorder, and 2 Telefunken microphones. Those are very good for the era. Magical stuff. A very nice small studio setup in those days. Ritchie brought his Harmony H44 Stratotone and little amp to the session. Since Ritchie was completely self-taught and came from musical traditions that were orally passed down versus written down, he didn't have any complete songs for Keane, just some riffs on guitar and some very loose parts of verses and bits of lyrics. Again, supposedly none of these written down either. Ritchie, with his raw talent, had rapidly absorbed the great sounds of Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, his favorite Little Richard, Bo Diddley, and other greats of the day. He had developed an energetic guitar sound with a unique style all his own. Keane set out to help the young musician on songwriting ideas with the intent on turning Ritchie's ideas into full-fledged songs. For several weeks after their initial setting, Bob, now called Babbo, and Ritchie met regularly for songwriting sessions. They developed a trust and bond as mentor and mentee. Keane even visited the Valenzuela household and was able to meet Ritchie's family. It was important for them to see that Ritchie was being taken care of and nurtured in his gifts and talents. Out of these sessions emerged the initial scenes for Come On, Let's Go, the title and main hook coming from a saying that Ritchie and his family used a lot around their home. Keane immediately knew the idea could be a smash hit, even in its rawest form. He could see the potential. It is often mentioned that there was no structure, only the initial line and the hook, come on, let's go. And so Bob got Ritchie to work through it, and together they eventually came up with the words and a melody. Note, it is worth mentioning here that the first demo of Come On, Let's Go shows up on the Richie Valens' The Last Tapes release that Delphi released years later. It is the audition demo that Ritchie recorded of the song. There's also the same version spliced together with live crowd noise on the Richie Valens In Concert at Pacoima Junior High album. The original demo version actually shows that the song was fairly well developed, guitar riffs and all, when Ritchie brought it in. In late May 1958, Bob Keane signed Ritchie to a contract with his label Delphi. It was then that Keane made the decision to shorten Valenzuela to Valens and to add the T to Ritchie. This was done to make Ritchie's name appear less ethnic, because Keane knew that DJs would not play his records if they knew he was Latino after seeing his name. And soon they went into Gold Star Studios, home to Phil Spector's Wall of Sound and many famous sessions just a few years later in the 60s. For these sessions, Keane assembled a top-notch group around Ritchie. Drummer Earl Palmer, guitarist-arranger Renee Hall, guitarists Carol Kay, Irving Ashby, bassist Buddy Clark, Red Callender, and pianist Ernie Freeman. This group was very well versed in jazz. All of them were working strong jazz musicians. Yeah, that's the wording. All of them were working, there should be a comma maybe, strong jazz musicians on the California scene. This core group of musicians would form the backup group for all of Ritchie's Delphi sessions. Earl Palmer and Renee Hall were already respected New Orleans jazz players who had come to California in search of more and better gigs. Earl Palmer and Carol Kay in particular went on to become a part of a group of Los Angeles session musicians, the Wrecking Crew. Some of you were waiting for that, I'm sure, when you heard the name Carol Kay, who played on hundreds of rock, pop, and movie sessions in Los Angeles over the next 10 to 15 years. Rene Hall would prove to be a pivotal addition with his arranging ability and talent on both guitar and bass. Hall had several hits using his new Dan Electro Longhorn 6-string bass, a guitar-type instrument made out of material called masonite. The Longhorn 6-string bass model had strings tuned an octave lower than a standard guitar. The sound was an interesting hybrid of bass and regular electric guitar sound, a sound that blended very well with Clark's upright bass work. The Dano sound added extra heft and drive to Ritchie's riffs, and when combined with Palmer's drumming and Kay's and Clark's rhythm, a new sound was born. You can hear Hall's Dan Electro double Ritchie's riffs on many of his songs, especially on Come On, Let's Go, La Bamba, and Ritchie's version of Boney Maroney, among others. Yeah, that instrument, I mean, it was a sort of a pioneering instrument for the time, trying to put a guitar in the hands of guitarists that sounded more like a bass, but not as soft as a bass. Dan Electro electronics are very bright sounding. They are notoriously, heavy on the treble, let's say. But they are very musical. They're just good at like one particular sound. They're not an overly versatile kind of tone. For a lot of guitarists that wouldn't necessarily want to use them for maybe an entire 1 hour, 2 hour set, unless they're in a band that, that works really well with. If they have another guitarist, maybe for something that would play like a mellower tone, maybe a guy with a Gibson or some other hollow body kind of guitar. Who knows? But I just wanted to say, like, there were other versions of that idea that came along later. The Fender Bass 6 was a similar thing that tried to it did a similar tone. It was good for guitar players that didn't play bass. You can hear the Fender Bass 6 being played by Tom Hamilton of Aerosmith on Back in the Saddle, that incredibly heavy, moving, chugging riff, dun 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 dun. So yeah, the Dan Electro folks hit on something special that other people really, really wanted to copy. Now, lots of heavy metal or, generally experimental young guitarists will play a baritone 6-string instead of a 7-string, or a 6-string instead of a normally standard tune, a 6-string guitar. Anyway, that's all talk for another time. Is it? No, probably not. I probably won't come back to it. I doubt it. But I'm just trying to say it's 2023 and the effects of the Dan Electro Longhorn, 6-string bass are still being felt. Let's see. According to Keane, Come On, Let's Go took several dozen edits or so to get right. Editing tape meant splicing it with a razor blade in those days. Only because Ritchie never did it the same way, let alone twice in the studio. Ritchie and Bob chose Framed for the B-side, 1954, written by Lieber and Stoller, originally sung by the Robins, who spun off Into the Coasters, which all their hits were written by Lieber and Stoller. Lieber and Stoller talked pretty openly about how they wanted to create almost characters for each member of the singing group, the Coasters. They wrote and arranged different vocal sort of voices depending on the guy singing it. That's why the low bass guy chimes in with a certain kind of a line all alone from time to time. Who, me? Yeah, you. Yakety yak. Don't talk back. They were using each voice to sort of create a different character. They were very conscious of that. They wanted the Coasters to do well. They weren't just writing songs for any old pop singer. They were like, no, we're going to engineer this for you guys, for your strengths. Kind of cool. Compared to the dudes at the time, they were just cranking stuff out for whomever. Let's see the editing of the disc. Bob took a reference disc to KFWB in Los Angeles, where DJs Gene Weed and Ted Quillen really liked the disc and began to give it substantial airplay. The song quickly became a massive hit in Los Angeles, due in no small part to the Latino population in the area. The song soon went nationwide and was a pick of the week in Billboard in September 1958, climbing into the higher levels of the charts in a matter of weeks. Oh, that was a lot of scholarly work, and there's more to come. At least, I would say, 1 or 2 more episodes about Richie Valens, and more of me making guitar noises in my living room for you to be buffeted with. Thank you for being here for all of it so far. If you are new, obviously there's more episodes for you to check out, and you have a lot ahead of you. It's fun though, and I'm excited for you to appreciate all the great things about rock and roll that I stumble and bumble through in my own particular way. Some of it you will know about, some of it you won't. I hope that you enjoy hearing me process it in my own goofy way. If you have already been listening to the show for a while, I thank you for being here. Thank you for staying true to a weird podcast that does not have a very defined routine. You're so smart and good for liking the things that I do, is what I'm saying. Please remember always, you deserve to be loved, you deserve to have a good time, you deserve to be creatively challenged, and you deserve to do things in your life that are, dare I say, nifty and generally agreeable. Please always still remember, no matter what, that rock and roll is the best. And so are you.
Rock and roll music and why I preach against it, and I believe with all of my heart that it is a contributing factor to our juvenile delinquency of today.
Please remember to replace the speaker on the post when you leave the theater.
Now